And as you hopefully know, in today's webinar on Oracy, our speaker Tom Beeks will explore the key issues that teaching staff must consider when planning how to develop Oracy skills of multilingual learners in an English medium classroom. If you've got any questions during the webinar, feel free to use the chat and pose any questions as they come to you. I will collate them and I will then pose them to Tom at the end of the webinar. But without further ado, let me pass over to Tom.
Hello, thank you, Shaka. Right, let's get started. First of all, just a big welcome to everyone. Great to see so many people joining us from different parts of the world and different parts of the UK as well. As we go along, please feel free to add any questions or comments that you've got in the chat. Always welcome that. And yeah, and if we have time at the end, I'll hopefully be able to address some of the questions if I don't during the actual talk itself. So this is what our learning intentions for today look like. So I'll just give you a few moments to read those. And looking at the introductions that people have put in the chat, it seems like we've got quite a lot of people who are EAL specialists, but I imagine we also have some people who might be classroom teachers or subject teachers as well. And many of the ideas we're going to be talking about today will certainly be familiar to you if you are an EAL practitioner. But the idea of this webinar is to help anyone, whether you're an EAL coordinator, school leader, EAL or subject teacher, anyone who has to or wants to implement the teaching of Oracy in your setting. Hopefully this webinar should give you some clear ideas of what you need to consider and what kind of strategies and activities might help you support the teaching of Oracy in a multilingual classroom. So we'll start off. This is what our map for today is, but we're going to start off with the obvious topic, which is, what actually is Oracy and why might it be useful for our learners? Before we move on to some of the more complex considerations. So very simply, whereas literacy refers to speakers' abilities to read and write, Oracy refers to their abilities to speak and listen and communicate, and more specifically, speak and listen in a range of different situations, task types, and subject areas. And there's a bit more to it than that, which we'll explore later, but that's the basic concept. And apparently I learned, researching this webinar, that the term Oracy was coined in the UK back in the 60s. And actually, it's not that widely known or used outside of UK education, which being from the UK myself, I hadn't realized. But I think even if you aren't from a UK context or working in a British school kind of context, I'm sure you'll be familiar with a lot of the ideas of Oracy that it often gets talked about in terms of things like soft skills or 21st century skills. Now, these are quite vague buzzwords, but I think the useful thing about Oracy is that we can define it and we can apply characteristics to it, which we'll talk about in a moment. And it certainly seems to have come back into fashion in the UK for a number of reasons. And so there are charity organisations like Voice 21 and projects like Oracy Cambridge who exist to promote the effective teaching of Oracy in schools and indeed broader society. So if you do work in an international school with a British orientation, you've probably heard about Oracy. And if you haven't, you probably will, because it seems like it's something that's going to become a key part of the new curriculum, the new curriculum review that's coming. And even if you don't, well, I think it's potentially a very powerful and transformative area of learning to focus on. So I think you'll find many of the ideas and considerations here still relevant and useful. Okay. And why is it useful, you might ask yourself? Well, if we look at the research first, the Education Endowment Foundation, which is a charity based here in the UK that does research on education. They did a study that suggested that oral language interventions can have a very strong impact on learners' attainment. They were measuring reading outcomes, and their research showed that it provided an additional 6 months of progress when implemented over the course of a year. So that's actually, that's a huge impact for an educational intervention. And they also found that it was useful across age groups. So it was useful primary, secondary, although they did find it was more impactful at primary and early years than at secondary, although it was still very impactful. Another positive thing about the teaching of oracy is that it's low cost, because most of the techniques and strategies don't require lots of expensive resources. Just teacher knowledge and willingness and ability to implement certain strategies and techniques. So yes, there might be some resourcing for staff training, but beyond that, it's quite low resource. And I imagine that's one of the reasons why Oracy is being promoted so strongly in UK schools at the moment by the government, because it doesn't cost a lot of money. And we can see how that might be appealing to most school leaders, can't we? Looking more in international school context, I think we can also identify that Oracy aligns quite well with the kind of inquiry-based learning that we see a lot in the IB curriculum, for example, although I know it happens in lots of other curricula as well. So if we think of things like in the primary years, the PYP, learners do an exhibition, or they do personal projects in the middle years, or they have a theory of knowledge exhibition at the IB diploma level. And all these kind of activities inherently involve a lot of Oracy skills to do well, to do successfully. So it makes sense to focus on Oracy in these types of schools if we're implementing these forms of curriculum. And it also means we need to carefully consider the cultural attitudes to Oracy in the classroom held by the local culture, or the cultures of our learners and their parents and staff, which we'll talk more about later on. And another key finding from some of the research or some of the studies and experiments that have happened in the UK is the sort of transformative effect, basically, of teaching students explicitly Oracy skills. So there's an educator called James Mannion in the UK, and they did a study at a secondary school where they taught Oracy to students at a lower secondary level. And the school went on to achieve the best set of exam results the school had ever seen. So he then, was very much, he's since been a very strong proponent of Oracy in schools. But he also mentioned it wasn't just the exam results. Students also talked about the effects of their confidence, the positive effect of their confidence on their relationships with their families and their peers and their friends as well. So it was, there was it wasn't just academic impact. There was an impact on students' sort of general well-being as well. So you can see why Oracy might be seen as quite a desirable thing to be integrating into schools. So we're going to think about now, what do we actually mean when we talk about Oracy? What are the skills? And also, what are the pedagogies? What does it look like in the classroom to promote Oracy? What kind of things can teachers do? And the first thing to notice is that there are two sides of the Oracy coin. This is another phrase I borrowed from James Mannion, the gentleman I just mentioned, who's the director of an organization called Rethinking Education here in the UK. He says there's two sides of the Oracy coin. The first one is learning how to talk, probably the type of Oracy that we would first think of if you're a language teacher or an EL specialist. So talking about the skills and the knowledge you need to effectively communicate. And the second side of the Oracy coin is learning through talk. So actually using Oracy as a pedagogical tool for improving learning. And that involves things like particular teaching strategies or particular type tasks or activities. So I'm going to explain in a bit more detail what I mean in both cases and give you some examples. And then we'll actually apply on top of that a sort of multilingual lens But first, we'll look at it more broadly. So for this section, I looked up the Oracy Cambridge project, which was in collaboration with the charity called Voice 21. And they created a framework a few years ago for teaching Oracy, aimed at mainstream education settings here in the UK. I don't know if anyone here has heard of this or whether this is something that you've experienced. I don't know how widespread it's been used or not, but I thought it was very useful. So I'm going to introduce a summary of their framework, and then we'll examine how it might need a bit of adaptation for a multilingual context. And they identified 4 broad sets of skills that can be taught as part of an Oracy program. And the first of those were physical skills. And so by that, they meant, first of all, things around your voice. So the fluency and pace, tonal variation, clarity of pronunciation. And they also looked at body language. So we're talking about gesture, facial expressions, and eye contact. And if you're thinking about this from a multilingual perspective, you might already have some concerns when thinking about teaching these things in a multilingual context. So hold that thought, because we will come back to that. There were also cognitive skills. So that involved things like focusing on the content of what you say, choosing what to say to convey your intended meaning and purpose, and then also building on the content of what other people say. It's also about how to organize what you're saying, how to structure your talk. It's things like being able to clarify or summarize what's happening in the conversation. So asking questions to seek more information, or being able to paraphrase what other people have said, for example. And also reasoning skills. So being able to justify your views and also being able to critically examine the ideas and views expressed by others. So that's the sort of cognitive skill area. Linguistic skills. And again, if you're an EAL specialist or a language teacher, this is kind of our bread and butter, right? But in this context where they're talking about general Oracy skills for first language English children, they talked about vocabulary and particularly choosing the appropriate vocabulary for the context. I love how they've just put language in brackets, register and grammar, which again, as an EAL specialist, I'm like, well, that's, that's such a gigantic topic, but it's one bullet point in their framework. So of course they mean by register the level of formality that we might use. And I guess by grammar, they're really referring to sort of using standard English grammar or standardized English grammar. Of course, they don't really mention what variety of English they're talking about, but this is for a UK context, so I guess we can assume it's standardized British English, whatever that might be. Now, and they also talk about rhetorical techniques. So these are things like using metaphor, irony, humor, or mimicry, which again, if as language teachers, we might think those are potentially areas of complexity for our multilingual learners. And finally, they look at social, emotional skills as well. So really, this is things like being able to work with others and communicate well with others and successfully. So there's things like guiding and managing interactions, taking turns in conversation, listening and responding. So, what we call active listening these days, and being able to show that you're listening, having confidence. And they describe this as through phrases like self-assurance and liveliness and flair. And again, I think if we look at this through an international lens, there might be a bit of a cultural bias here, because perhaps these qualities are thought of through a Western lens, but they may not look the same in other cultures. And also audience awareness. So that's just taking into account who you're talking to, who your audience is, and what their level of understanding on a topic might be, for example, and adjusting your communication accordingly. So that's the sort of overall framework, and certainly they see this collection of skills and knowledge, the organizations that are promoting them, as something that can and should be inserted into our curriculums. And actually, if we map some aspects of this framework onto things like the IB curriculum, Or if you look at the IB learner profile, for example, it talks about learners being communicators who can express themselves confidently and creatively in more than one language. So we can see how there's a lot of overlap. And I noticed somebody's already posted their own experience of teaching Oracy, and saying they've seen a significant impact. That's really interesting. Okay, including for EAL learners. That's brilliant. So yeah, evidence that perhaps it is anecdotal evidence that this is working. But we can think of it as a curricular concern, but we can also think about it in terms of pedagogy, and teacher action as well. And again, there's probably two parts to this. So we can talk about, we can distinguish between Oracy tasks and activities that students do, the learner activities, and we can think about what I call teacher moves, or the strategies or techniques used by teachers to promote Oracy. I'm not going to go into lots of detail, but just to give you some examples, learner activities that might promote Oracy would include things like frequent use of pair and group work for obvious reasons. They involve talking. Inquiry-based or project-based, task-based methodologies, which tend to involve a lot of student-led negotiation of meaning and collaborative planning. Of course, that can also happen in other methodologies as well, but they're particularly prevalent. Presenting information, so the skills needed for presenting it can vary vastly depending on the purpose or the audience for the presentation. So there's a lot of rich language work that can be done there. And of course, debating is quite a common one that we see in certainly a secondary level. Although again, I think it's often a tricky thing to do very well. So yeah, Oracy can really help us perhaps with that kind of activity. And the other side of it are the teacher moves. And again, this could be multiple things, but I'm talking about things like being able to build dialogue, and strategies for extending and guiding conversations, including using silence, which again, research shows us is actually quite an effective tool, especially with our new to English or early acquisition learners, to help them produce more language. Questioning strategies, again, things that you've no doubt learned about in various stages of your teacher education, but different types of questioning we can use: open-ended questions, closed questions, purposeful use of display questions where the answer is known by the teacher, or use of referential questioning where the teacher doesn't know the answer and it's a more open type of question. Techniques like cold calling, where we nominate a learner at random rather than using hands up, and techniques like think, pair, and share. So the child, we ask them a question, we give them time to think about it individually, then they share their idea with a partner and a pair, and then they might share it more broadly with a group or the classroom or the teacher. That's just a sample of the wide range of strategies that we can use to support learning. There are, of course, lots of others. And you'll find many of those techniques on our great ideas pages on our website if you are new to EAL or you have colleagues who would like to explore those kind of things in more detail. All right. So having looked at what Oracy might include for all learners, including those who are already fully proficient or are monolingual English speakers, we're going to now look at what considerations we will need if we want to ensure that Oracy is taught effectively in multilingual contexts, which, if we're working in an international school, I would imagine is kind of everybody. But as we know, a lot of schools in English-speaking countries as well will have multilingual classrooms too. So here's just a summary of what we just looked at. So this is the summary of the Voice 21 framework for Oracy skills and knowledge. But we have to recognize that first language English Oracy programs may lack effectiveness for our plurilingual learners. And what are the considerations that we might need to implement when teaching these Oracy skills? So for each category, I kind of brainstormed a list of considerations. So this may not be a complete list, and you're welcome to add your own thoughts as we go through, but we'll start with looking at those physical skills that we talked about. So if you remember, this was voice and this was body language. And I think the first thing to say in a multilingual context is the importance of creating a safe and comfortable learning environment for our multilingual learners. And by that, I mean creating a safe environment for experimentation, for linguistic experimentation and risk-taking in language. So things like, normalize making spoken language mistakes, right? It's going to happen when we're learning another language. Accepting different accents and different pronunciations in our classroom, different varieties of English, asking people to repeat themselves in a respectful way. Understanding that, yeah, we're not always going to understand what people are saying because we all have different accents. And asking people to repeat themselves in a way that's respectful, and recognizing it's tricky for everyone to get their tongues around new sounds and sound combinations, and acknowledging that, yeah, actually, sometimes it can be funny and it is okay to laugh if somebody, I don't know, mispronounces a word that means something different. But we should do so with kindness and empathy. And, I think a really simple way to model that as a teacher is, getting the learners to teach you tricky words in their own language. And obviously you can watch them revel in delight as you struggle and mangle the sounds in their language. But it's building that sense of, we're all in this together. Everyone has this issue. It's difficult for everyone. Even first language English speakers will struggle learning another language, of course, and just making it kind of normal. The other thing is to have opportunities for modeling, practice, and rehearsal of new language as much as possible. Just this concept of before expecting learners to produce new language in front of others, allowing them to have that time to practice or rehearse. So again, that think, pair, share sequence we talked about is quite useful for doing that. And it's also, from a teacher's perspective, involves understanding that some new to English learners may prefer to remain silent at first. Although I would say that the more low stakes opportunities that you can give them to produce language, the less likely they are to need a silent period, right? I think the silent period comes about because they don't have the opportunities or they don't feel safe to start speaking when they're new to English. So I think that is something that we have the power to change. We talked about using tone of voice. So again, one of the things for multilingual learners is addressing our assumptions and raising our awareness. So we may need, for example, to explicitly explain to our multilingual learners how tone conveys meaning in English sentences. This is information that if you're a first language speaker of English is just sort of innate to your experience of learning English. You just kind of absorb it as you grow up. And by what I mean is using tone to convey your emotional response to something, because the tone might convey, boredom or enthusiasm, and things like that. So, for example, you might want to explain to learners that not using a wide variety of tones, speaking in a monotone, can sound like you are bored to a listener, especially if they're an English first language speaker of English. Rising intonation at the end of a sentence is going to sound like a yes or no question. Whereas if it's falling at the end of the sentence, it's going to be more like an open question, a WH question. And just being aware that there might be cultural differences there. One example I can think of is in German, for example, there is less tonal variation than in English. And particularly for male German speakers, they associate high levels of change of tone in a sentence with feminine speech, which is why you might get that stereotypical kind of Arnold Schwarzenegger monotone in a lot of German speakers of English. And they can sound very monotone. But we can also appreciate why that, I don't know, teenage boy, for example, may be very reluctant to introduce a sort of natural English intonation into their speech if they feel that it's making them sound more feminine. I'm not saying that, you know, it's probably due to various sort of socio cultural issues around sexism and stereotypes. I'm not condoning those, but I'm just saying that there might be reasons why learners speak in the way that they do. So for staff, understanding that a particular tone may not be the result of a particular emotional stance. It may simply be a multilingual learner applying the tone conventions of another language to English. Likewise, with raising explicit awareness of tone of voice, we also need explicit pronunciation teaching for our multilingual learners. So the key thing here, I think, is being able to focus particularly on sounds that affect the comprehensibility of our learners' English. I'm not going to go into any detail here, but if you search for lingua franca core, you'll find information that's been researched about which sounds in English make English more comprehensible, and which are the sounds where it doesn't actually really matter that much if you get it wrong or you don't get it exactly right. You might be surprised by what you find. Again, this is probably an area more for our EAL specialists to focus on. I wouldn't expect classroom teachers or subject teachers to become experts on teaching pronunciation, but at the very least, you can give our students a chance to repeat and get their tongue around new words and things like that, even if we don't go into the details. And lastly, we can understand that body language conventions and conventions around eye contact and facial expressions will be different between cultures. I'm sure those of you that live in other countries or have lived in different countries in the past have noticed this, right? I mean, the obvious one is gesture. I think, you know, we notice there's a difference between the way an Italian person might communicate with their hands and say somebody from Japan. But there's also differences in things like eye contact, which in Western cultures, you know, expresses politeness and honesty and confidence or friendliness. Whereas in other cultures, actually too much eye contact might be considered intrusive or rude, especially if you're speaking to somebody of higher status, such as a teacher, if you're a student. Even things like the use of smiling is different in different cultures, or nodding or shaking of your head. So just having that awareness is going to be important. All right, looking at cognitive skills and thinking. So in this area, we were talking about the importance of students being able to structure their talk, organize what they're saying, think about what content they want to talk about. Things like clarifying and summarizing as well are really important. And to do all these things, obviously, they need the language for it, which we can't assume they have. So we need to teach it to them. So we need to teach this functional language. So we're not just talking about language for the subject content, we're talking about the language for doing the task, the phrases for agreeing or disagreeing, for asking questions and for responding to questions, phrases for checking understanding. Now, this is obviously an enormous amount of different language. We wouldn't provide or teach them all at once, but you can introduce them slowly over time and build up that repertoire of language. If you want more detail on this, see our webinar from last year on enhancing classroom talk, and we talk in a lot more detail about how to really promote this type of language in the classroom. The other thing that's amazing for all learners, but it's valuable especially for our multilingual learners, is using graphic organizers. This is going to help us scaffold and structure their thoughts. You know, an obvious example would be something like a conversation map, which literally sort of diagrams out how a conversation should go when you're wanting them to discuss a particular topic. Again, if you would like more information on that, check out our Enhancing Classroom Talk webinar we did last year. Also, we've done a webinar on graphic organizers if you want a little bit to go into more depth on that, but now is not the time for that. The other thing that we can definitely do is make use of learners' other languages to help them clarify their thinking, where that's going to be useful for them. So this is what is known as translanguaging, and it might be things like encouraging students to brainstorm ideas or discuss their ideas in their home language before summarizing those ideas in English. Now, this won't necessarily work in all classrooms or be useful for all learners. I'm only advocating this for when it is useful to your learner, and it's going to be particularly useful for learners, again, at those lower bands of English, because it's going to allow them to get those ideas out when they don't have yet the language in English to do that. We can also make use of learners' other languages to access content. Of course, if our aim is for them to learn, why would we force them to do it in English in cases where there are alternatives available? So, using translated texts, assigning them home language research tasks, bilingual glossaries. For younger children, might be encouraging parents to talk about homework or topics at home using the home language. So saying that's fine, as long as they're having that ability to talk about the topic in a language that they can use successfully, that's going to benefit them in the long run as well in their English as well. So linguistic skills, and there's a few things here to say. Again, if you're an EAL specialist, most of this is going to sound fairly obvious, but one thing I want to stress is the importance of, first of all, assessing our learners in an effective way, so we know what level of proficiency they have, but also the importance of early mainstreaming, making sure they're in those mainstream subjects as much as possible, as early as possible, and that they're able to participate in those lessons as early as possible and as broadly as possible in their school career, because that's what's going to develop the academic language. And I know schools have a variety of models for doing this, but I think, we need to be aiming for them to be there and getting the support they need in those mainstream classrooms as much as possible, as early as possible, if we can. Vocabulary support is obviously vital, and this will include things like the pre-teaching of vocabulary, providing glossaries and word mats, and taking into account of prior exposure to English is really important as well. So making sure you're collecting that information and the teacher understands what previous exposure to English children have had in their classroom, because children who have been exposed to English medium environments previously are going to have much deeper vocabulary knowledge than those who are new to an English medium classroom. Again, it seems obvious, but it's important to be aware of those differences. Grammar support, again, not the time or the place to go into lots of details. Please see our great ideas pages and previous webinars for lots of amazing strategies for helping with developing grammar whilst also teaching content. But we're talking about stuff like using gap fills, barrier games, dictogloss, all that good stuff. And the more that we can train and support our subject teaching or classroom teachers to be comfortable using those techniques as well, then the better. And, again, that's that collaboration piece between our EAL specialists, our language specialists, and our classroom teachers is really important. Awareness raising of register. So we talked about register and having different levels of formality. Multilingual learners don't automatically know what is slang, what is formal English, what is appropriate in different areas. Indeed, first language English learners don't necessarily know this either, right? So we need to raise that awareness and be really clear about it and not assume that learners will recognize that a particular word or phrase is more or less formal. And again, you don't need to be a language expert to do this. We can do this in quite simple ways using very student-friendly language by asking, can we use this word with our friends? Can we use this word when we're talking to the head teacher or a boss, or simply asking them, is this word better for speaking or writing? Acknowledging that actually, spoken language is usually less formal than written language, even when it's used in an academic context. And if you have a multilingual classroom, make use of those cross-linguistic comparisons. How do you say this in your language? Getting learners to compare keywords and phrases in English and their own languages. And that encourages this noticing and awareness raising of similarities and differences between languages. It raises kind of meta-linguistic awareness about lots of different things. It might be, noticing that certain word endings mean the same thing in English and French or Spanish, and then children can start drawing on their knowledge of different languages to support their learning in English. And the last point to make here is, again, very obvious, but it's really important for all school staff to understand this, is that the type and intensity of support, of linguistic support, will vary according to a child's proficiency in English. It's not simply a case of they do their intensive English course when they arrive and then they leave and then that's it, they're fine. No, we need to be measuring their assessment through their school career and providing the appropriate level of support, because they're going to need linguistic support all the way up until they are fluent. And even then, they require linguistic support. It's just not any different to the linguistic support that we would provide to a proficient speaker of English. And lastly, the social and emotional skills we talked about. So again, this is the ability to work well with others. And just as with the cognitive skill set, comes down really to the student's mastery of the functional language that they need. So providing that language is going to be key. Learners will need the phrases and vocabulary to collaborate and respond effectively in conversation. So, again, when setting a discussion task, for example, don't just provide sentence frames or prompts for the questions, provide them for the responses and answers as well, so that they have models for both. Another really important thing is going to be creating an asset-based ethos towards multilingualism, and building a sense of pride and accomplishment in being plurilingual, nourishing those plurilingual identities. And this is really going to help with confidence, okay? So even if students know that their English might not be as well developed yet as other classmates, they understand that this is okay, it's just part of the process, but they know the abilities to communicate in their other languages are valued and utilized as well. And I think then that really helps sort of them, again, just normalize. It's just learning English in a multilingual school environment it's just part of what we have to go through. It's fine. And it doesn't make me any less of a successful learner. So this links, of course, to the normalizing the use of home languages in classroom for learning. Again, I emphasize for learning aspect of this. Again, if you want to find out more, look at our webinar on translanguaging that we did last year, if you want more detail around this. And normalizing home languages also links to this idea of having more cultural awareness in general about how different people from different places communicate. So when we talk about understanding our audience, then we need to explicitly talk about cultural differences in expectations and behaviors, both by potential audiences, but also by the person talking as well, especially in contexts like presentations and things which students might be doing as, especially at sort of secondary level. And as I mentioned before, understanding that there are cultural biases around things like what confident communication might look like, and how these qualities are expressed can vary. I think with the stereotype would be the sort of TED Talk speaker striding confidently around the stage, making lots of eye contact without any notes. That's the sort of archetypal model, but that's one way of communicating successfully. There might be other ways as well. And I think that's a really important message, not only for our multilingual learners, probably also for our neurodivergent learners as well. So just to apply this to sort of a real classroom, I'll go through a couple of case studies. So the first one is from a primary classroom. And I'm going to use an example of a strategy called talk to writing, which is basically making sure students have lots of opportunities to orally practice and rehearse structures that they need for writing before they do a writing task. And in our example, we'll have a group of primary EAL learners of varying proficiencies in English are learning about fairy tales from different cultures. They've been learning about different stories and so on. And now they're going to write their own version of a fairy tale. So the teacher might employ a number of Oracy activities to help this. First of all, the teacher gets the learners to brainstorm possible vocabulary that they might use in a fairy story. So learners can work in their small groups. The teacher might make sure that any new to English or early acquisition learners have another person in their group with the same home language so that they can maybe help translate words, or they can have It can be a bit of peer teaching. Teacher can provide a word mat with visuals containing useful vocabulary. The teacher can model each word, so the students are getting a model, and give the students opportunity to repeat back the words as well. Drilling, we call this. And the teacher might focus particularly on words that have got, say, unusual spelling patterns or tricky sound combinations that might confuse our learners. Thinking of a word like knight, or a knight, as in a knight in shining armor, with the spelling of which is a bit confusing in terms of the pronunciation. Perhaps the teacher could do a quick review activity, a vocab review activity with her learners. So maybe put them in small groups and they take turns miming a word from their word list, and the other students have to guess what it is. So, we're reinforcing meaning, but we're also just giving them that opportunity to be producing that language again and again and again. And those sort of tasks, if you get your students trained up to do them in small groups together, can be quite potent and powerful, and they don't take very long to implement. The teacher then hands out a graphic organizer with different boxes for different elements of the story and a simple storyboard. The teacher might scaffold this as well by taking the learners through each box and generating suggestions, and so that they understand what each step is. And then the learners can complete their own graphic organizer with their own ideas. But then perhaps afterwards there could be a collaborative element. So the teacher might put the learners into home language groups to talk through their stories with each other, allowing the more proficient learners more to support the English of those with less proficiency, and also allowing the new to English learners the opportunity to share their ideas, fully, and develop those fully in a language they're fluent in before they need to use it in English, and also they can ask for translations and things like that. So only after all those activities would the students move on to writing their stories. So having those chances to remember, learn, and practice the relevant vocabulary, listening to models and discussing structure and content of their story orally is likely going to really strengthen their writing. And of course, that could be scaffolded further with things like having sentence prompts for key phrases in the story, or linking words or sentence frames and substitution tables and things like that if needed. Okay. So this example comes from a secondary context then, just to look at a different age group. Let's imagine there's a secondary humanities lesson where students are presenting a case study of a natural disaster, and they have to discuss the causes and possible solutions or mitigations. So, we're talking about a sort of secondary class. Students obviously have a lot more, they have a lot more confidence and the cognitive ability to think about all these complex things at this point. So the class is multilingual, but let's say in this context, the students all share the same home language. Let's imagine it's a international school in the Netherlands, and all the students speak Dutch, for example. But maybe the teacher does not. So the teacher might provide clear success criteria related to Oracy for the presentation. So this could be like a checklist, I will speak at a steady speed, or I will use appropriate language for my audience, or whatever it might be. And that could also be translated into Dutch to make sure there's clarity, real clarity of learning on this. The great thing about having success criteria as well is it can be used afterwards as like a peer review tool. So they can watch each other's presentations and maybe use the success criteria to review or to self-assess their own presentation. The teacher might discuss with with each student and allow them to choose their intended audience for the talk or the presentation. It's really important. Like in real life, nobody just does a presentation, right? That's a weird thing we get kids to do at school. In real life, there's always an audience for a specific purpose. So defining that audience and then discussing how that might affect the type of language you use is really useful. So, are you talking to the general public who don't know much about the topic? Are you talking to people your own age, or young, or children? Are you talking to scientists, professionals? How is that going to affect the formality of the language you use, for example? Of course, you could also the teacher provides a list of sentence starters and linking phrases to support the grammar and vocabulary needed. And the teacher might also encourage the use of, for example, using Dutch if during the presentation you forget the English word or for what you want to say, so that you can maintain that fluency and that communication. Again, your audience all speak Dutch, therefore it's not a problem if you slip in the odd Dutch word when you can't remember how to say it in English. But also teaching them paraphrasing as well, how to, define a word if you don't know exactly how to say it in English, is going to be a really useful skill to use there as well. And then the teacher might provide some rehearsal time. So, we don't expect them to do it straight away. Allow them to rehearse the presentation at home. Allow them to record the presentation, perhaps, and then maybe even for some learners, if they're really uncomfortable standing up in front of people, they can simply play the recording, a little screencast of their presentation. I think for some learners, that's really powerful because they gives them the opportunity to rehearse, to record and re-record at home in a comfortable environment without worrying about being judged and put on the spot. Okay, it's just an example. As we come to the end, I just want to make a few key points about home language use and oracy, or home language sort of exploitation, I guess, in the classroom. Because if we think of oracy as the art of communication, then I think it makes sense not to limit that to a single language. And we need to be able to utilize learners' abilities in all their languages to ensure smooth and successful communication. And obviously that's particularly true in very multilingual, heterogeneous environments that we see in international schools. So some key points that hopefully most of you here probably are fully aware of, but these are things that I think are really important to share with colleagues, with parents, and with students, are that, first of all, multilingualism and bilingualism are an asset. They're not a communication difficulty or a delay. That exposure and use of home languages is going to help and not hinder the acquisition of communication skills in English. Again, we know that if you have strong language skills in one language, you can apply those to a new language that you're learning. So it can be really beneficial to develop those home language skills. There's also a strong ethical angle here in that developing and maintaining home languages can be seen as a right, and it's essential for supporting cultural identity and for strengthening family and community bonds, for example. Now, this is often thought of more in contexts where you might have immigrants to another country, rather than perhaps this kind of situation you might get in an international school. But it's still worth understanding that, if we're denying learners access to their home language, are we erasing their identities? Now, it's a complex question. There isn't a simple answer. And when you consider the incredibly complex and varied socio-linguistic contexts of international schools as well, it is complicated. But I think it's an important thing to consider, and it's an important issue to consider the unintended or hidden messages or ideologies we're promoting when we kind of value some languages over others, even if we're not doing it intentionally. And aligned to that, I want to sort of make you aware of one thing that certainly I've done a lot in my career as a teacher, which is being aware of the language police. And I wonder how many of you in the classroom have ever said something like this to your student when they've tried to say something in English. Have you ever said, "You can't say that"? Or, "Oh, we don't say that"? And I know certainly in my career, I must have said this hundreds of times without ever really thinking about it. But I think when we're teaching in an English medium international school, it's really important to avoid unnecessary policing of language. So if you feel the impulse to say something like this to a student, especially if you are a native speaker of English, I think, or, fully proficient speaker of English. If you feel the impulse to say something like this, maybe stop and ask. If you say you can't say that, well, why not? And if the answer is, well, the thing that they said makes no grammatical sense, or it would cause an obvious misunderstanding, or it's completely the wrong register for the context, then okay, I think that's absolutely fine and reasonable. But if none of those things are true, then does it matter if the intended meaning is being conveyed effectively? Is it actually important that we're um, policing their language in that context? If we're saying something like "we don't say that," I think it's important to ask, well, who is "we" in this sentence? And again, if the answer is, well, people like me or educated native speakers of my particular variety of English, then again, take a moment, because unless you're familiar with every single variety of English that's spoken in the world, are you sure this isn't a phrase or a usage that is commonplace somewhere else? And also, would you give this feedback if the child who produced it was a first language speaker of English? So be wary of native speaker intuition and false confidence and gatekeeping in an international setting, is what I'm saying, because I think there's an alternative approach, which might look like this. So instead of saying you can't say that, I think we can use feedback that's a bit less, we are the language police. We're here to confiscate your unusual collocations or slightly misplaced definite articles. And we can do something that's a bit more accepting of the variety of Englishes in the world, and that understands that language is open source, okay? And it's not the preserve of a particular nationality or social group or individual. There's no single entity called English. There's simply multitudes of different English varieties, and they've got different levels of visibility and status and acceptance. So, for example, instead of saying "we don't say that," perhaps you could say, I would usually say, just framing it personally. So personally, I would say it like this. I think that's much more kind of acceptable. Something like, well, this might work better. So again, we're thinking about how effective it is, rather than necessarily if it's perfectly, grammatically formed or has every single, every single word is exactly how a native English speaker would say it. Again, sometimes asking a student to rephrase can help clarify what they mean and prompts them to try again and maybe produce something more effective. So of course, it's okay and it's important to ensure learners are familiar with and can use standardized varieties of English when they need to. But it's also, I think, really important to make them aware that standardized English is just another variety, and isn't the only way to communicate effectively with other people. And I think this is particularly important to talk about in the context of oracy in education settings, because as language and spoken language in particular are often seized upon and weaponized as a proxy for other forms of prejudice. And that could be race or sex or socioeconomic status. So having open conversations with our learners and modeling a way of talking about and using language that encourages belonging and curiosity and acceptance, as opposed to foregrounding differences and implying that there's only one right way of saying something and communicating, is going to be really important. So yeah, just don't be the language police if you don't need to be. Is my main message there. Okay, and just to wrap up, I'm going to touch briefly on oracy and assessment, because again, that presents a few key issues. And there are a couple of broad points to make around this. First of all, is to be really aware that for our plurilingual learners, we should be avoiding only assessing them using standardized Oracy assessments designed for first language speakers of English. And I know lots of schools will have these because they'll have purchased them from some company that's based in an English language speaking context that is selling assessments for first language English speakers. But we have to be aware that they are not going to give you valid or useful information about your plurilingual learners on their own. Okay, it's not to say we avoid using them completely. It's probably not realistic, but we shouldn't be relying on them alone. As we've mentioned, it's really important to think about home languages and include home languages in our assessment of learners when they enter the school, so that we have some sense of how strong their languages are, their other languages are. Again, this doesn't have to be formal. This might be simply asking learners to write something, to label a diagram, to have a conversation if you have a member of staff or who speaks that language, so you can get a sense of where they are. Doesn't have to be a formalized test necessarily. Yeah, that's a good question, Sarah. I'm going to come on to that in a moment. What else could we use? Yes, exactly. I will come on to some suggestions in the next slide. The other key issue is having clear SEND referral procedures in your school and making sure there is some clarity and you have a system for differentiating between your difficulties that are caused by learners simply struggling with the complexities of learning a new language and difficulties that may be evidence of some other learning difficulty. And there was some recent research in the UK which suggests that actually multilingual learners are being underdiagnosed for special educational needs. But we could also imagine that they might get, diagnosed incorrectly if people are not aware of, language acquisition and how that works. And overall, any assessment of Oracy is going to need to be ongoing, formative, and adaptable to each learner's proficiency in English. So, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. And in terms of assessment activities, here's a kind of list of other alternatives. So other ways of approaching it will be classroom observations, of course, just noticing how the children are using language in the classroom. Even things like an informal setting. So talking to school staff, talking to the teaching assistant, talking to the dinner lady, the anecdotal records of children's speech in informal settings, like how are they interacting with other children at lunchtime and in the playground, listening in. Using checklists or rating scales. Obviously, the Bell Foundation has an assessment framework that you can use for things like this, but there are other ones out there as well that you could use that are specific for EAL learners. And then we talked about, didn't we, using specific success criteria for Oracy activities that is appropriate for the learners and their proficiency level. Using video recordings, because again, if children are able to record themselves at home when they're under less pressure, you might see something different to when they're put on the spot in the classroom and they're feeling super anxious. As we mentioned earlier, when we're talking about those presentations, there are also exploit opportunities for self and peer assessments as well. So that comes into the use of success criteria. And of course, you can combine those with your standardized Oracy tests, but just don't rely on them alone. So in summary then, if your school's planning to implement an Oracy program, I hope you feel you've got the knowledge and confidence to support them in adapting it a bit so that it includes them and doesn't exclude them. That is my main message. And I think I'll pass over to Sharka to wrap up the webinar.
Lovely. Well, thanks so much, Tom, for the webinar. We did have one question. Maybe we've got 1 minute, so very quickly. When you spoke about, providing home language synonyms, etc., I think Daisy asked, are there any common pitfalls when looking at home language synonyms, when using ChatGPT or Google Translate, for example? I think just to make sure that the translations are accurate.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing to say is I think especially with ChatGPT, don't rely on it too much if you can, or if you are going to get it to give you translations, try to provide them in context of a sentence. So don't just give it a single word, because then it doesn't know what the context is.
Yes,
Give it a
and I
sentence to
would maybe
translate.
also, yeah, sorry
Yeah,
to cut in. I was maybe also thinking just trying then to translate it back into English,
yeah,
to see what it comes back with, whether it's
yeah,
the original word you
yeah.
started with or something else.
Um,
That can help as
but
well.
also sometimes having a bad translations can be a learning opportunity. So if you do have a Google, if you've done a Chat GPT translation, and and you could even ask, well, with older students who have that cognitive awareness and language awareness, you might even have a discussion about what's wrong with this translation. Is this would you change it? But anyway, yeah, there are. I think we have to be a little bit careful. But ChatGPT is, when I've used it, for example, or in these large language models, they're quite good at simplifying language. I don't know how good they are at translating. I think it depends on the language and how potentially, how much information it's got on that language. So, but yeah, anyway.
Thanks, Tom. And we'll, yeah, we're run out of time now, but I just wanted to make you aware. We have got one more webinar coming up before the summer, and that will be on the 10th of June. It will be advertised very soon, so please keep an eye out or join our mailing list to know when bookings open. I also wanted to make you aware, and I think, Tom, could you move the slide, please, that
Yeah,
all our online courses for the next school year are available to book for on our website. You can see the calendar here. We are running 12 courses, including a brand new course for school leaders. So feel free to pass the word on to leadership in your school. And if you're very keen to do some professional development before the summer, we have a course on adaptive teaching starting next week, and bookings are still open. So if you or a colleague of yours would like to do some CPD very soon, then that's a possibility as well. And just as a reminder, we will send out a link, an email with a link to the recording within the next day or two, and also all the links that were mentioned during the talk. So don't worry if you didn't manage to note everything down. Thank you very much for joining us today. Hope you found it useful, and hopefully see you again soon.
yes, thanks everyone. Bye bye.